So some pretty enormous Warhammer 40k shakeups today. It looks like OC0 units aren't going to be able to do actions anymore, but big Titanic characters now will be able to shoot while they do so. And the big Warhammer 40k update is just 2 weeks away, with points changes, new FAQs, and new rules for the Admech. Let's talk about Games Workshop's latest preview. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest Meta Watch video, in which they gave us some really big and interesting clarifications to the game, both for the Pariah Nexus mission deck and also for a whole bunch of other things coming very soon. A few weeks back, Games Workshop said that they were going to bring out a new mission deck called Pariah Nexus, basically making the core changes and updates to the game from the released Leviathan mission deck that came out at the start of 10th edition, much in the same way as they've done chapter-approved books in the past. We already knew a bunch of details about this, including those interesting secret missions, which seem to be one of the biggest shakeups, and also some boosts to help out battle line units in certain missions. Today though, we got some big new details in a Meta Watch video, which more so than quite a lot of Meta Watch videos recently was actually kind of full of content, lots of interesting stuff as to what's coming next. I do feel like for a few of them recently they have mainly talked about vagaries as to how they aim to do things in 40k balance, which is still interesting but stuff that we've heard many times before. Some of the biggest news for the update is that there will be a new balance data slate and points changes to come alongside this mission deck, and that does mean that they're accelerating their timeframes by really quite a lot. As per their normal quarterly balance data slate and points changes and things, they usually do it around about every 3 months. So I think that most people were expecting that this will be coming towards the end of July or early August, and that we had really quite a good long time to go yet. To be honest, it was kind of a surprise that they announced the Pariah Nexus mission deck to be launching and going up for pre-order this weekend. I was honestly expecting it to tie in with that time frame and launch late July, early August. I guess it could mean that there's a very long wait till the next update they do, which could be sometime October time or something. They have demonstrated that they're kind of flexible with their time frames though, so I guess we don't really know at this point. Should be pretty exciting for a shake-up to the game. I feel like 40k's balance really isn't in too bad a spot right now, but there's certainly some units that could use attention, maybe Admech and Adeptus Custodes being some of the most obvious. I'm sure Tyranids will also need some focused attention given the changes here. I'm guessing that this digital update will be in around 2 weeks' time. Often digital updates tend to go live on the week before the actual official release in stores, and that would tie in well with the Sisters and Genestealer cults and when we'd normally expect them. I'd guess that everything will go live at the same time, new points for Sisters and the cultists, and then this rather big new digital update to the game to go alongside all the new changes that come out in these cards. Shouldn't be too long to wait there, and I'll certainly cover that here on the channel when it comes out. Perhaps some of the most interesting things from the update, though, are two other things that they mentioned. We did know that Admech were going to be getting changes at some stage, and it is confirmed that that's happening now. So hopefully 2 weeks' time, Admech should have a few major changes to their index, hopefully making their units more powerful and cost a bit more in-game, just so the cog boys feel like they're a bit more use at actually damaging the enemy, as a fair few people are finding their army just kind of depressing to play at the moment. It's not that they can't win games, it's more the way that they do it just isn't much fun for people. Otherwise, beyond that and for the wider game though, really good news is that there's an actual FAQ coming for Warhammer 40k. It did seem from previous updates they were just trying to get all this done in the designer's commentary, where really I think there was still a lot of demand just for a few basic yes or no questions to certain unclear aspects of the game, and that's going to be published alongside this major update, and I think that's a really good step. Will be interesting to wade through that and see if there's any unexpected rulings, but anything they can do to stop tournaments having to kind of house rule things one way or the other and get intent is probably for the best. Let's jump into the changes though, and as mentioned the biggest one is to Actions and Objective Control 0 units. Just for an overview of what they've told us before though, basically the contents of the mission deck are as below, 69 cards total. It'll reprint the rules for the ways that core missions are played, and occasionally changes in that can be kind of big and shake up the game a bit, and otherwise you basically do things as before, draw your missions with a deployment map, mission rule, and a primary mission, and then you have 2 secondary mission decks. You can either go fixed or tactical for that, but basically the cards in every single one of those sections have been redone to some extent. The biggest actual change around structurally are that gambits are gone, replaced with secret missions, things that probably aim to do more or less the same thing, the theme being basically a catch-up mechanic for a player who's fallen behind, but these ones look like far more credible options that you might actually be tempted to take, and also feel like the sort of thing that your opponent can still go out of their way to counter, and overall I feel like the mechanic is far better received than the gambits were so far. Let's get into that change for actions though, and what we've been told about that. These are basically a return to the sort of system that we had in ninth edition, where rather than having the rules for each action type thing being defined by each individual card, these are now things that your units do for certain missions. One's from the Leviathan deck with things like deploying teleport homers or cleansing an objective. The idea is that your unit moves up to that objective or where it needs to be to do that action, and then it usually has to give up its shooting and making any charges while it gets busy with doing the thing that it needs to, sacrificing a bit of damage output for the good of the mission and achieving their faction's goals. As it goes, I think it's kind of an interesting mechanic. You basically have to make the call as to whether or not you need the extra damage or whether you can sacrifice that unit's abilities to score yourself a few more victory points. Usually the latter makes sense, but occasionally it might just be best literally to do all out damage and stop the enemy from being able to score points later. These were centrally defined in ninth edition, though in 10th edition they were sort of there as a kind of stealth mechanic, written out on each individual card when it was relevant. The system did work, but maybe was a little bit clunky, and maybe stopped the rule from having too much depth or complexity as to what things could or couldn't do these actions. Now, though, it's a central mechanic, and they basically went through a whole load of situations in which things could or couldn't do these actions. It sounds like the core idea is the same, no shooting and no charging, but now there's further restrictions. OC0 units can't do actions anymore, which is, I'd say, the biggest change, as they are often exactly the sort of thing that were taken to do actions, things like Nurglings, Fenrisian Wolves, maybe Servitors, or Biovore-spawned Spore Mines, little peripheral screening units that could often just turn up and complete these objectives, even if for a fair few of them the OC0 did imply they were kind of mindless to some extent, hence why the theming was they couldn't take primary objectives because they couldn't really be trusted to do that. And it did feel a little bit weird in my opinion that they were doing secondary objectives, like say Fenrisian Wolves carrying the teleport Homer into battle and then setting it up and programming it. I don't necessarily think it was an enormous problem, but I think it was something that basically everyone was expecting that they might change at some point during the edition. They did do changes that were very similar in ninth edition. In general, though, this is going to be really bad news for those units, and they did mention that they might drop in cost as a result. Now they'll just be there more for screening and peripheral annoyance type units, as opposed to winning you the game for victory points, I guess. Otherwise, beyond that, Battleshock's units can't do actions in general. I feel like that was a restriction on some of the cards, maybe not all of them. But I guess that's one extra way of making Battleshock a bit more impactful. Certainly not the worst idea there. I did kind of wonder if they might make any sort of core change to Battleshock, but doesn't really sound like it at the moment. Otherwise, there's some medium-sized changes to not being able to advance and do an action even if you have assault weapons, and you can't do actions in melee even if you have pistols. Previously, the requirement of an action was being eligible to shoot, so it did mean that having certain keyword weapons in your unit could mean that you were eligible to do an action, even if the majority of the models in your unit might not have been able to shoot. That certainly could be pretty relevant turn 1 for some armies. You might not be able to advance to a midfield objective and do an action on it straight away. Might be a bit of a reward for things that actually move fast on their base move profile. I did feel the doing an action in combat because you had pistols all felt very arbitrary indeed, to be honest. Otherwise, though, there's one positive thing in units that could do actions that couldn't before. Apparently, Titanic characters can now do actions and still shoot, but not charge. I guess that's good news for any ranged knights out there, any super heavies with big guns, where often it just might not make sense to do the action if you're missing out on like 400 or 500 points worth of shooting in a turn. And quite a nice little peripheral buff to the Titanic knights there, and might be just one extra little factor in making you a little bit less dependent on armigers or war dogs. Doesn't really help melee dedicated big knights like gallants or lancers or anything like that, but certainly nice enough for things that are sort of mixed build or dedicated range like the Dominus or the Crusader. Overall, it is going to be a pretty big shake up to mission play and how you build for objective support. It might shift the balance a bit onto the cheapest units that aren't OC0, so probably small units of 5-man squads and things like that, and might genuinely make certain secondaries a lot harder to do for certain factions. I think my first thought will be that Tyranids will be hit extra hard by this, given that they've sort of been just focusing on scoring excessive victory points from throwing Biovores out and using Rippers and things just to remain sort of in the game. I really think though this is probably going to be a positive overall for Tyranids in the long run. If the faction's not just being propped up by some scoring shenanigans, then Games Workshop might focus on giving their actual damage dealers a bit more help, hopefully. And it might be a bit nicer not to take just one obligatory Biovore literally for farming victory points in every single list. Hopefully they manage to make those changes in this update as opposed to having to wait for another one though. Otherwise, we've got a few more clarifications. We hadn't heard much about deployment maps so far, but apparently they're going to be changing a little. Some of them will be exactly the same, though there's only going to be one that has anything bar straight line boxy deployments now somehow. They said that only one mission had diagonal board edges, which I'd guess might be this one, given that it's really quite easy to measure out from the corner of the board to the centre of the board. But I guess we'll have to wait and see on those counts. Otherwise, for the primary missions, one thing there's a bit mixed feelings about is that the Chilling Rain mission is gone. This is basically the mission rule that wasn't a mission rule, basically saying that the battlefield as it is with no additional effects, and just quite a nice simple one if you wanted to play a game without any extra details to remember in, if you already had plenty of stuff going on to remember already. At least anecdotally, certainly in more casual play, I've quite commonly had games where people have drawn a primary objective and then both players have said, yeah, I don't really like that, let's do Chilling Rain instead, just to keep it balanced, or not have to put up with an annoying mission twist special rule that they really can't be bothered with. I'm guessing due to that, the removal of the Chilling Rain one might not be universally appreciated. I suppose there's nothing to stop you house ruling that you don't use a mission rule if you're playing in more casual games, I guess. I'd guess that far fewer people will choose to do that though if it's no longer a defined option. I guess their intent is to make sure that every mission has something a little bit different about it and makes you engage with the mission play a little bit more. Particularly if some of the mission rules are one of the mechanics in which they have some interesting stuff to help out battle line units, so maybe they're trying to encourage a bit more regular play of things like that. Speaking of which, in the last preview they had told us that there were battle line buffs coming in the mission rules section of the pack. Apparently about half of them give advantages to datasheets with the battle line tag on them, where previously they were a bit more random, such as no deep striking on objectives, minefields on objectives, or 2 command points for a command point reroll. So depending on the exact mission, some armies that go heavy on the battle line will gain advantages. I think it's not the worst idea in the world to incentivize people to build around a few more core troops, but this is one of the mechanics that's going to skew things game to game. Say if you've got an army that just goes massively heavy on battle line units just naturally, they're going to gain an advantage in any mission that has a battle line boost. Say versus an army that takes few or even no battle line squads because their choices in the codex just aren't very good. I feel like it could be argued that it's usually a bit of a weakness of a mission if it's just massively better for one army than the other, literally depending on what card you draw. Though I feel like the buffs for battle line units are maybe helpful, but not so bad that you might not be able to overcome them, as they're basically only getting one extra small rules boost per mission, you don't get them all at once. In their previous article they showed off these two, raised banners, which means that if you put battle line units on objectives, you generate 1 victory point at the end of the turn. You can only raise a banner on each objective once over the entire course of the game, so it's not going to be a spectacular amount of victory points, and both players should easily be able to get some of them, but I guess could give a tiny edge to players who had a lot of battle line units just going about doing what they were doing normally. The other one was rapid escalation, allowing a small points cost of battle line units to come in from strategic reserve turn 1. Could be interesting to get a little bit more OC in the centre board, not the worst option to have, but also not ridiculously powerful. In the video though, they basically told us a couple more mission rules that are basically going to key around the actions that you can do. There's one for battle line units doing actions in combat or when shooting, and that seems like a potentially quite powerful one if you've got a bunch of battle line units scrapping over the midfield objectives. Being able to shoot the enemy while you still do the mission things does lead you to a fair bit more damage and not having to choose. The same for them being bolted down in melee. I guess that might genuinely impact your choice of certain fixed action type secondary objectives as opposed to going tactical if you've got loads of battle line units and you know you're playing this mission. The other one is bringing back an option for battle line units to advance and do an action if you draw this mission rule, and that could be pretty helpful being able to threaten that out to the mid board. Overall, both of them seem like handy enough boosts to battle line. I guess you would just have to make sure that you absolutely do remember them, given that they're the sort of rule I think they could be easily forgotten by players in game. Just not having either of those being options the vast majority of the time does mean that you might not think about them when you have the choice to do them. Particularly as in some games, I feel like for at least one player, one of these rules just might not come up at all. It might be an option that you can do, but just doesn't really make sense to do it on that turn, so it might not be super impactful every game. Otherwise, the next section is primary missions. Previously they showed off this Terraform one, and this one scores some victory points normally, but also involves doing actions in the midboard. These actions are sort of defend style ones, so you start them in your turn, then need to survive the enemy turn to complete it, but when you have done that, you gain victory points on that objective for the rest of the game, and you need to do them in the midfield. That one seems interesting enough, basically a good reward for terraforming the objectives that are still possible to win without. Otherwise, in the video, they talked about a couple of other ones that have been redesigned. The relic mission is still there, but there's restrictions from putting objectives too close to each other. Not really too much to say about that without seeing the full text, I suppose. And the Sites of Power mission, which was one that I was a little bit less of a fan of, that's had a change, so it's no longer just tied to characters standing on those objectives and empowering them. It's going to have a similar sort of theme, though I feel like it was quite a good idea to get away from individual datasheet keywords. Again, like the battle line things, you might just have some armies that go really heavy on characters just because that's naturally what they want to do, and other armies go very minimal because their character choices just aren't very strong. And again, that was a rule that could kind of disproportionately hurt some armies more so than others in an otherwise balanced matchup. Otherwise, finally, to round up the other changes, they said that secondary missions had a clearer score breakdown, which was a little bit more confusingly written before. I quite like the little grid table that they've got going on there. Looks like they'll list an option for tactical objective and fixed objective, and exactly how many victory points you get as one number, so it's a bit more obvious than it was before playing Add Up. The only one that they'd shown off before was this March for Death one. Your opponent picks 3 units and you need to destroy one of them and then get 5 victory points for doing so. That could be kind of painful early game where there's loads of units that might be hidden. Might be a bit more doable late game, but only if your opponent has to pick something suboptimal. Finally, just to recap those secret missions, which I think are perhaps one of the most interesting things here, they replace gambits and are trying to be a catch-up mechanic, but there's a number of big differences that make the mechanic far more useful. You can only choose the mission if your primary mission victory point is less than or equal to your opponent's one. You get to pick one of the 4 secret missions, and then you keep it hidden from your opponent so they don't know which one you're going for, and then that mission will allow you to score somewhere between 0 and 20 victory points, depending on whether you achieve it or not. And rather than completely binning off any other scoring for primary objectives and things, it now doesn't stop you from scoring primary, but it does cap your score for that at 20 victory points. So overall, between that and the secret mission, you could score 40 victory points versus the normal 50 victory points that you could score from primary total if you maxed it. It now seems like a far more viable option if you think that for the rest of the game you're probably not going to score too much more on primaries, but you might be able to do one of these secret missions. And you can of course still go around doing your secondary objectives. The secret missions they showed off with these ones: command insertion, to control the enemy's home field objective with your warlord at the end of the game. Genuinely could be possible if you have a ridiculously big and powerful warlord, depending on the game state. War of attrition, to get one battle line unit partially within the enemy's deployment zone, and make sure none of their battle line units are anywhere within their own deployment zone. That could be really quite powerful against armies that don't have their own battle line, and particularly if you've got ones that can pop up in different places, like with Genestealer cults. Shatter Cohesion is one if you're winning the damage game. You either destroy all enemy units, or make sure that all units are either battle shocked below half strength, or over 3 inches from objective markers. I guess if you deplete but not destroy a whole load of enemy units, that could be achievable, though I feel like most of the time, if you're in this sort of case, you might well still be able to score primaries anyway. And then finally we've got Unbroken Wall. This one's to control 3 or more objectives not in your deployment zone at the end of the battle. I guess could save everything just for one last push, hide behind terrain, and then swoop onto all the objectives if you went second. But again, if you can do this one kind of easily, you might well be able to score more points via primary missions. Overall, I think they seemed fun, and initially to me a lot more interesting than Gambits, which are often just a bit unachievable and a bit random. These have definitely been upped in power, and often look like they could be a very credible way towards winning a battle, depending on the exact units that you have available and the matchup. Hopefully they will be impactful in a way that they're sometimes a choice, but not just a bit of a depressing way for an opponent to get an easy win in a game where they're basically being kind of outplayed. Overall, fairly exciting stuff coming from the core rules update though. I'm looking forward to seeing new changes for the Admech and a cool FAQ to the game. And sounds like we're going to have a pretty mad amount of 40k content coming over the next couple of weeks. Balanced data slates, points changes, and a whole shake up to the way that missions are played. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you make of all the news? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.